everyone, welcome back to my channel, My Reading Life. My name is Heidi, and I'm here today to talk about some more books that I finished in the month of October. This is basically part 2 of my recent reads video that you may have seen already. So in the month of October, I have finished some really chunky books, and I am super excited to tell you that I finally finished The Bully Pulpit by Doris Kearns Goodwin. This is subtitled Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. So I started reading this book way back in June, and actually set the book down for a while in the middle of the summer, and then picked it up again and continued on as a buddy read with Patrice and Karen and Doris. And this is a really good book. However, I think that is probably about 25% too long. And I don't fault really Doris Kearns Goodwin for that, because she obviously did her research. She found out a ton of interesting stuff about both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and all of these sort of first long-form journalism, investigative journalist type characters. And she just wanted to make sure we knew everything she knew. And it just kind of got off in the weeds sometimes with some of the different legislation that the different presidents were pursuing and things like that. I could have done without some of that detail. But overall, I really did like this book. The book starts out with a very positive view of Teddy Roosevelt and his rise to power within the politics of the time. And then he and William Howard Taft meet very early on in their careers, in their adult lives, and become very close friends and work partners. And as Teddy Roosevelt rises to the presidency, he brings William Howard Taft along with him as an advisor, and then his, I believe he's the Secretary of War under Teddy Roosevelt, and then as his successor, as the president to follow him up. And then that relationship ultimately sours during Taft's presidency. And that's where we begin to, the scales fall off our eyes about Teddy Roosevelt, and he loses his golden tarnish quite a bit during the Taft years. And we see that he is not a perfect person. He has some issues with sharing the limelight. He has some issues in letting go of power, whereas William Howard Taft comes across as perhaps not as great of a leader as Roosevelt, and not as decisive as Roosevelt, but is more of a decent, good person, basically, who finds himself in a job that isn't well suited to his character. And then as their relationship, as we learn about their relationship, we're also learning about how the beginning of investigative journalism really impacted policy and how our government worked at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 1900s. And this is the beginning of the magazine McClure's, and the beginning of really, like I said, long-form journalism of the investigative type. And a lot of the writers like Ida Tarbell, you may have heard of, who were very influential in changing public opinion at this time for things like food safety, labor safety laws, labor rights in terms of number of hours in the workday, and all those sorts of things. And because of their truly stellar work in investigating the ills done by big companies to the working person, a lot of things changed in our country. So that's pretty fascinating stuff as well. I almost think all the investigative journalism stuff, the muckraker stuff, could have been pulled out of this book and put into its own standalone book on its own, because that stuff, I mean, that's a lot of information, and it was really fascinating, but it was sort of mixed in the political stuff about these two presidents, and it just, this is a long book, and that made it a little bit longer. So I would say, if you enjoy presidential biographies, if you're not put off by a very detailed nonfiction, Doris Kearns Goodwin is an excellent writer. And in fact, this book at the end, the ending of this book brought me to tears a couple of times, which is not something that normally happens in nonfiction of this kind. So she is an excellent writer. I think she just got carried away with all of the knowledge she gathered in researching this book. So overall, great book. I then finished my second book for Latinx Heritage Month, and that is The Turkish Lover by Esmeralda Santiago. I buddy read this with Alba and Doris. This is the third book in her memoir trilogy that begins When I Was Puerto Rican, and then the second book is Almost a Woman. So Esmeralda Santiago was born and grew up the first part of her childhood in Puerto Rico, and then came to New York City when she was like 11, 12 years old. And this particular volume of her memoirs, she is in her early 20s, a young woman, leaving home for the first time, starting her first serious romantic relationship, trying to separate herself from her mother and the rest of her family, trying to make her way in the world and determine what she wants to do with the rest of her life. At the center of her story is this romantic relationship that she forms with a man from Turkey, Ulvi, and that relationship is very tumultuous and probably abusive. And you will spend a lot of this book going, oh no, Esmeralda, no, as she makes some questionable decisions about this relationship. But she is just a fantastic writer. She truly brings you into her situation. You feel her emotions. There's a lot to relate to in terms of growing up, your relationship with your family and how you separate yourself from your family, beginning your career or your schooling, and how you deal with all of that, how you deal with your first taste of freedom from your parents, all of that stuff. She is just so relatable, even though I've experienced none of the things that she experiences. It just was really great to read about. Along the way, Esmeralda Santiago is also grappling with her identity as a Puerto Rican, because as she separates herself from her family, she also separates herself from her Puerto Rican identity. And during the course of this volume of her memoirs, she has to come to terms with what she thinks about being Puerto Rican and how she wants to embrace or not embrace her heritage. And I thought that part of this memoir was also really well done and excellently told. So highly recommend this entire memoir trilogy, which begins When I Was Puerto Rican. Very great. I then finished my first book for Victober. That is Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. Again, another 700 and some page book. I mean, I just was reading all the thick books this month. This book has been on my shelves for a while. I love Anthony Trollope. I read and loved the Barset Shear series of novels. I started the Palliser novels and haven't finished all of them. But this book is a standalone. This book is a satire and basically a riff on the financial situation in England in the mid to late 1800s, and how much society, high society, revolved around who had money and who didn't, how somebody who is assumed to have money can take over society and become like the shining star of the social scene without any real documentation or anything to back up the fact that they really do have money, other than the perception of the other people around them. And so the center of this story is a man named Melmotte, who is a man that has recently moved to England from Europe, and who, immediately starts spending a lot of money and starts to move within the upper echelons of society, and everybody just assumes that he has money. And then it's about these other English characters that sort of revolve around Melmotte, whether it's the society people or the government officials or the other financial people of the time. Very, very funny in parts. I mean, it has all the great Trollope things like funny character names, some very feisty women who, in the end, their stories, the women in this book, their stories turn out not in the way that you always expect, and I think very amusingly done as well. There is one romantic relationship sort of at the center of this that ends more in a traditional way, but still has a very satisfying ending. And everybody in here is like, nobody's perfect. Everybody has flaws, and I think Trollope does that so well. He renders his characters such that, you know, you can see the humanity in everybody, and you can see why people do what they do, and you can see how flawed everybody is, and how they're just trying to fit themselves in the structures of the day. The one thing I will say is this book is extremely prejudicial towards Jewish people, and it was really kind of gross to read about at times. So just heads up on that. Be aware of it. It's in here, and it's not great. Like, it's not great. And I think a little bit Trollope is sort of trying to bring that to the attention of people, and he's not like condoning it necessarily, but it is a big feature of this book. And so that is kind of hard to read about. And then the last book I want to talk about is another chunker, another over 700 page book. And this one is a book that's been on my reading list for a long time. It was on a list that I've been working on since high school of recommended reading for college-bound students. This is The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer. And this is a World War II novel, which is all about a platoon of soldiers who are on an island in the Pacific named Anapopai, and they are trying to take this island from the Japanese. And so this book is, I first started listening to it on audiobook, and I had to give that up after about, I'd listened to about half of the book on audio, and then I gave it up and I started reading the physical copy. And I have to say, for me, it worked much better in the physical form than it did on the audio form. And I'm not exactly sure why. I don't think the audiobook was done poorly. It's just that this is a highly masculine book. Okay, this is what I would call dude bro lit, right? These are all white characters, all hyper masculine people. Of course, they're soldiers. It's all, you know, they talk about is either, you know, killing people or their fantasies about sex, or that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all. I mean, there's some stuff about drinking and smoking and stuff like that. But honestly, you know, there are no women characters except for the women that the men are imagining, you know, either their wives or their girlfriends or women they'd like to have sex with or women they have had sex with. It's very difficult at times to read. Again, like The Way We Live Now, this book is really anti-Semitic, and it was more difficult to read than the Anthony Trollope book because this is World War II, and ostensibly the U.S. is fighting to, you know, get rid of the German Nazi regime, which is, you know, exterminating Jews in the Holocaust. But the men in this novel there's two Jewish characters, and they're treated horribly by the rest of the men in this platoon, and they're called terrible anti-Semitic names, and it's just hard to read. This book, I don't think, has aged very well. I think it has some interesting things to say about what it's like for men at war, what it was like, particularly in this time period when men had to be in the jungle, and like the conditions that they were asked to live and work in, and how horrible that was, and the things that they were asked to do, how horrible that was. Again, this is highly prejudicial against Japanese people, highly prejudicial against Mexican people, highly prejudicial against Black people. I mean, you know, if there's a prejudice or a racial slur to be thrown around, it's going to be thrown around in this book. Not a lot of likable characters in here. I had empathy with them because they were put in a terrible situation and asked to do terrible things. And I get that. And the whole point of this book is like, what does it take to break you down to your rawest form, right? The naked part of what conditions are men brought to their most naked, savage place? And then what do they do at that point? Okay, I get it. It's just not for me, right? This is just not the kind of fiction I like. If it hadn't been on that list that I'm trying to get through, and I only have like 4 books left to do the whole list, I would never have read this book. Also, too long. Just too long. Needs to be shortened. Norman Mailer just decided to like write every word he ever thought of, I think. And he does admit in the foreword that this was his first book that he ever wrote, and he wrote it while he was also reading Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and that some of the, that style of novel was what he was going for. So, you're going to get wordy, right? You're going to get a lot of characters, which there are so many characters in this book. But it's just, I don't want to read any more fiction that's just about dudes, like, especially white dudes. Like, I just don't want to. So yeah, those are the rest of the books that I've read in the month of October so far. I hope that you are all doing well and finding some great books to read, and I will talk to you later.